Hello and welcome to the Guya Samaja Center. I hope you're enjoying the video. Please consider making a donation by clicking on the Y button on the upper right hand corner of the screen. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Of refuge and bodhicitta, to take refuge and generate the mind of loving compassion, the ultimate mind of the good heart, bodhicitta, as our motivation for the class. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Because to start with, actually, this particular class came about at the request of Rajiv, who found this text by the Dalai Lama on emptiness and asked to kind of have some discussion. And I'll say a couple comments to start with. One is, we felt when we scheduled this, I wasn't thinking this way, but it actually feels positively sort of auspicious or something, because yesterday began a period of these particular month, and particularly these 2 weeks. According to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, kind of celebrate the Buddha, a time of the Buddha, right? Because June 9th is sort of the anniversary of the day that the Buddha, it's the Buddha's birthday, which is also the day on which he achieved enlightenment. And according to some, it's also the day he passed away. I sometimes think it's remarkable he achieved enlightenment on his birthday. It reminds me of, at first I thought, oh, that's unusual, and then I thought of Thomas Jefferson, who died on July 4th, and I thought, sometimes people, days that have a special resonance for a person. He wrote the Declaration, signed the Declaration of Independence, and died on the same day. Right? The Buddha was born and then achieved enlightenment on the same day. And so, actually, Swami Dalai Lama mentions this in the text. And so, there's a famous point made by both Lama Tsongkhapa and Nagarjuna, where they both say, they both say it in slightly different words, but they say the same point, which is they say, there are many reasons and ways to show our respect to the Buddha. And they say, but if you understand this teaching on dependent origination, right, they say that's the ultimate praise to the Buddha, right, because that's the unique quality of the Buddha. The Swami Dalai Lama in this text says, dependent origination is the slogan of the Buddha, which is funny. I've heard his only say that before too, where he kind of says that's the, if you were going to capture, if you were going to create a slogan that sort of captured all the Buddha's teachings in one, it would be dependent origination. And that's why it says, because this is a text that says here, the title is "The Key to the Middle Way: A Treatise on Realization of Emptiness." Right? And so this makes this point that the meaning of dependent origination is the meaning of emptiness, and the meaning of emptiness is the meaning of dependent origination. And that the kind of, the ultimate unique quality of the Buddha, right, and the quality that his Holiness even says in here, and the quality that allows one to have faith or respect or trust in all the other teachings of the Buddha, is this teaching on dependent origination. So in a sense, it's quite appropriate that if we're in this time of, I was thinking that also, sometimes I'll say, oh, it's a holy time right now of the Buddha. I think, the original meaning of holiday, of course, should have been holy, right? We've lost that sometimes in our culture, the sense of how not all holidays feel holy necessarily. But in that sense, a holiday. So anyway, so this text is on emptiness, and so like I was saying, so it feels quite appropriate. Obviously, the text itself is 24 pages, so we won't cover everything in it, but I thought I'll mention a few key points, and then we can have some discussion or questions and things like that. And so, this text actually, one point that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who composed this, makes, is he says, at one point he says, to truly understand emptiness, he advises studying the works of the great masters, the great pandits, the great scholars of Nalanda Monastic University, right? Like Nagarjuna, repeat. These, wonderful treatises that they wrote. But then he points out, he says, of course, in modern times, there are people who won't have time, and also won't have time to study some of those works. Also, some of those works are not available in English, and so he composed this brief text as a way of kind of helping people to approach an understanding of emptiness and gain some appreciation. And so I'll cover a few key points that he covers here. The first one, he begins with this phrase, it's all about the mind. And he makes a point that, happiness and suffering, or like being sort of stuck or being free, depend on the mind. Right? That's the mind is the basic source of our well-being or our suffering, which is quite clear, isn't it? Because in other words, most, actually it's true, right? There's a certain amount of suffering that comes in the body, of course, right? But mainly suffering is a quality of our mental consciousness. And it's true, isn't it, also that, let's see, right? Even when somebody's suffering in their body, if they feel it's deeply meaningful to them, then sometimes they're quite okay. Right? Whereas when a person's mind is miserable, there's no way to make that okay. And from a Buddhist perspective, also, like, let's see, right? Ultimately the suffering, ultimately all the suffering of samsara comes from the mind. And enlightenment itself also comes from the mind. So in that sense, the mind is primary, is the primary topic of transformation in the Buddhist context. And so in study, and actually I'll say this point also, in a way, we could say in studying emptiness is like, it could seem that from one point of view like philosophy or something. But really studying emptiness is studying our own mind. Does that make sense actually? You'll see as we go through this. In other words, it's trying to understand how do I perceive things? And are there ways that I'm perceiving things that are accurate or inaccurate? And are there ways that I'm perceiving things that are causing me well-being or causing me suffering? So in that sense, studying emptiness, there are points where there's a lot of, reasoning presented. And so it could seem like it's like an intellectual study, which there are intellectual elements to it. But ultimately, the purpose and the point of studying the teachings on emptiness is to study one's own mind. And to kind of go more and more deeply into the details of how one relates to what one thinks of as reality. One sense of self, one sense of the world, of other people. So that's really the point of studying emptiness, and this only makes that clear. So he begins by making this general point, though, that that happiness and suffering come from the mind, and that he's saying that as we go into this topic, what we're going to be doing is working on how do you transform your own mind, and first understand your own mind, then transform. And then as well as I'll just cover this briefly because that was a point that we haven't talked about a lot. Is in terms of Buddhism now, there are, actually it's an interesting point. There are two ways of positing what does it mean, or saying like, what does it mean to be Buddhist. So one is to say the person has I've taken refuge. I've taken refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And so one then starts, one can label the person, saying, okay, I've taken refuge in the three jewels, therefore I'm Buddhist. That's one way of sort of asserting what it means to be Buddhist. Here as Helen just mentions, there's another way that's different than that. Like there are two different ways of sort of describing. The other way is to say, is what his own calls, generally called the four seals, right? So, and that means one posits, is somebody Buddhist or not according to their view. Does that make sense? Their worldview. So there's in other words, that, and if one's own worldview is not in accordance with these four seals, one is not really Buddhist in one sense. If it is, then one is Buddhist. Usually when they differentiate this or discuss this, they make a point, if a person's quite like a simple person who just took refuge and doesn't study philosophy and isn't interested in that, then that's sufficient to say they're Buddhist, right? If they took refuge, in other words. But for somebody who's contemplating, contemplating tenets, or contemplating philosophy, then all Buddhist philosophies, and Sonis makes a point when he addresses this, he says, these four, there are many different, sub-schools of Buddhism and different philosophical, philosophical sub-schools, you could call it. But they all hold to these four seals.
So almost looks like we are differentiating between wisdom part of it when it comes to the view of the four seals as opposed to the faith part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, according to faith, it would be refuge. If you're getting into wisdom, it would be these four seals. Exactly. And so I'll briefly just mention them. So the first one is, it says here, all products or all composite things are impermanent. So it means anything that arose from causes and conditions is impermanent. And impermanent in this context has a particular meaning. There's a gross level on which, of course, in other words, if something came about due to causes and conditions, it will eventually end. That's the gross meaning of impermanent. But there's also a subtle meaning that's implied here, or meant here, which is that it changes moment to moment. In other words, so impermanent in this context means if something arose due to causes and conditions, right, it changes moment to moment. That's one tenet of all Buddhist schools, right? So there's no produced phenomenon that abides without changing moment to moment, or that will abide forever. Right, so what's a produced phenomenon, right? Your body, your mind, yourself. Actually, all the things you interact with. They differentiate produced from unproduced because philosophically they say, for example, like empty space is not produced due to some cause or condition. Nobody sort of, you don't construct empty space out of something. But our bodies, our minds, our lives, our offices, our houses, our cars, right, everything, all our food, all that's all products, right? Things that arise due to causes and conditions. So all such things are impermanent, they change moment to moment. Second point is all contaminated things are miserable, it says here, right, are in the nature of suffering. And so in this context, the contaminated thing means a thing that's related to mental afflictions. So a thing that arises in relation, that sort of has a quality or gives, either arose from or gives rise to the three root mental afflictions. The mental afflictions are ignorance, grasping or attachment or desire, and anger. So that means, so when we say all contaminated things, it doesn't mean something that has bacteria on it, right? In this context. It means actually our body and our mind, ultimately, right? If you look at us as ordinary people, we have mental afflictions, right? So anything that has mental afflictions or is related to mental afflictions is involved with suffering. And so that's the second seal. The third seal is all phenomena are empty or selfless and selfless. And we'll get into what that means in a minute. That's the majority of the text. But that one teaching is really, some of these other, the first 2 points actually, there are certain Hindu schools that would agree with. Whereas they would agree that all products are impermanent. Not all Hindu schools, but some. And some other philosophical systems would believe that, right? Whereas modern physics would agree that, for example, all products are permanent. The third one, that all things are empty or selfless, is really, as only as Dalai Lama often points out, that point is unique to Buddhism. Only Buddhism teaches emptiness or selflessness. And then the fourth seal is that nirvana is peace. So, and that, what's the meaning there, right? It means there is a state, right, in which, going back to the point about contaminations, there's a relationship between these different seals, actually, if you look at it. Right? The point of all contaminated things that have mental afflictions are miserable or include suffering. But then this point, all phenomena are empty or selfless. So if one realizes that, that's the path to eliminating the mental afflictions, which gives rise to nirvana. And so nirvana is a state beyond suffering. And all Buddhist schools agree that there's such a thing as nirvana. There's such a thing as liberation from suffering. And I'll make a point here, because this only gets into this later, but I think it's relevant at this point. So so first of all, those are the four seals. If one holds to those, one can say that's the basis of, from a perspective of philosophy or wisdom, you can say that's a person who holds those four views is within the context of Buddhist worldview. But again, it's always made this point later, but I think it's relevant. Near the end, he says, he basically says, why study emptiness? Right? This topic of this text is emptiness. It's just, so why would somebody study emptiness? And it's related to these four seals in this sense. From a Buddhist, both philosophy but also psychology, in other words, a practice perspective. If we check up on our own mind, again, because that's the main topic of study, and we have to go quite deep. This requires a deep level of introspection, and you also check for yourself. But but what Buddhist philosophy and psychology are saying is that the way we view ourselves and others and the world around us includes something inaccurate, a kind of ignorance. Not an ignorance of just not knowing something, but an ignorance of wrongly understanding how things exist. That's not just intellectual. In other words, it's there even in our dreams. In other words, it's a deeply ingrained in our way of relating to everything, is a misconception about how things exist. And due to that misconception, all kinds of mental afflictions arise. Mental afflictions like hatred, craving, addiction, pride, arrogance, and so on. And so that all of those come from a kind of wrong grasping wrongly at how things exist. And so the implication of that, which again, this is what the Buddha is pointing out, but he actually says you have to check for yourself to see in your own experience if that's true and how that's true, right? But what the Buddha is saying is this, is that, so each of us, right, wrongly conceives how I exist and how things I relate to exist. Based on that wrong grasping at self and at object, other, we then give rise to, if we view the other as negative, we give rise to a kind of hatred or fear. If we view the other as attractive, then we give rise to a kind of grasping. If we're grasping at ourselves in a certain way, then we give rise to a pride or insecurity, right? Comparing ourselves to others. And based on those, we kind of create actually an endless variety or endless sort of process of elaborations of mental afflictions. Right? We elaborate all kinds of mental afflictions and all kinds of distortions and then negative emotions and then negative actions. And that's what samsara is, actually. Samsara is not something separate from that. Does that make sense? So due to that kind of process, we then, in this life we suffer, and then we create the causes to suffer again and again and again. So what Buddhism is saying then, and this is why we have to study emptiness if you want to achieve nirvana, in other words, going back to nirvana is peace. The idea is this. Somebody points this out, so I'm trying to say it the right way, exactly as he puts it. What he says is, if you gain wisdom, understanding emptiness, it's a direct opposite to that ignorance. That makes sense? It's like an antidote, a direct antidote to the ignorance that wrongly conceives how things exist. And because ignorance is incorrect, if you generate the wisdom that correctly understands, it's actually this way, another way of putting it is this, is ignorance is grasping at things in a certain way. The wisdom understanding emptiness is the direct understanding that things don't exist that way. And so it eliminates that ignorance. And the point is, if you can eliminate that ignorance, then ignorance itself subsides. Based on that, the other mental afflictions that arise from ignorance also subside. Does that make sense? And in that way, gradually one eliminates the mental afflictions by way of wisdom. And once the mental afflictions are all eliminated, that's nirvana, actually. That's liberation from suffering. And so why study emptiness? Because it's the path to liberation from suffering. And it always points out, and there is from the the Buddha, what the Buddha is teaching is there is no other path to the ultimate liberation from suffering. There are other methods to temporarily suppress certain mental afflictions, or to distract ourselves from certain other, either distract ourselves or repress them or suppress them, but as long as there's grasping, ignorance, grasping at things incorrectly, the mental afflictions will come back. It's like the other day I was in the garden and I was noticing there was like this plant with a lot of thorns on it. So I had like gloves, but when I tried to pull it out, the thorns went right through the gloves. So I thought, oh, I'm not going to do that. And so I just cut off. I cut the point of this like thorn plant, right? But the root was still there, so it was going to come back, of course. I thought, well, at least it's not going to. At least it's gone for now, but it will come back, right? But if you really want to get rid of it, right, you have to pull it out from the root. Does that make sense? I'm using this as a metaphor for a moment. So the idea here is that there are other methods that will cut off like some of the thorns, so to speak. Right? But only the wisdom, understanding, emptiness goes deep enough to uproot the cause of the suffering. Right? And so we have to. So if we want to achieve nirvana, which is peace, then we have to meditate on emptiness. Is what Asonis is saying. There's no other path to that kind of liberation, to a permanent cessation or liberation from suffering. And so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit again because we can't cover we can go into the other details, but I want to cover a few main topics, and then we can, if people have questions, or we can kind of go back over things. But so Sonis is saying, so those are the reasons, that's some of the reasons to meditate on emptiness. Right? So then, Sonis gets into this point, so how do you actually meditate on emptiness? Right? What's the process? And again, you'll see, in large part, it's by understanding our own mind. And so, Sonis, Dalai Lama makes this point that we have to he calls it identifying the object of negation. It starts on page 5, that section, if you're looking at the text. And so actually, what does it mean to identify the object of negation? Start this like, the object of negation is not some it's not something outside of your own mind or your own experience. That's the first one. So the object of negation, a few minutes ago I was saying we grasp at things wrongly. Right? So to identify the object of negation, it has to be in your own experience to identify how you grasp things wrongly. Does that make sense? Because if you can't identify that, then when we say emptiness, right? Emptiness means empty of that things exist in a way that are empty of this superimposition that we make onto those things, right? We impose something that's not there onto ourselves and other objects. If you can't identify what that incorrect superimposition, that incorrect projection is, then you can't eliminate it. Does that make sense? You can't challenge it. Because emptiness means things are empty of that, right? So it's like, it's like this for a moment. Like, in other words, I'm just using this as a metaphor for a moment here, but, if we say, is this room empty of an elephant? Right? Well, you have to know what an elephant is. Right? There is, like, if you never heard, if you were to say that, I don't know, is there a Nepali word for elephant?
Hati.
Hati, right? So if you didn't know that was the word for elephant, I said, is this room empty of a hati? And many people here would say, I can't tell you if it's empty of that or not, because I don't know what that is, right? And so you wouldn't be able to answer the question, right? But if Rajiv helped us and said, that's the word for elephant, right? Then you could say, oh, okay, well, elephants are quite big. This room, you couldn't miss an elephant. We're in here. Okay, it's empty of the elephant. Right? But if you don't know what a hati is, for example, then it's impossible to say whether there's one here or not. Does that make sense? In the same way, in our own experience, we have to be able to identify this thing that we project or grasp at or deeply feel also exists in ourself and other objects, and then we can analyze, is it there or not? See, and that's what we're going to get to. There are many methods that His Holiness presents of how to analyze in order to come to a conclusion, does it exist or not? But if you just contemplate, does something exist, but you don't know what you're looking for, right? Like, it's not going to be effective. It's not going to have any effect, actually. It could actually have a negative effect, if anything. So you have to begin by understanding, what is it in my own experience that I'm trying to check up on, right, and see if it exists or not. Yeah.
So the object of refutation or the negation is a concept here, and the concept has to be as close to the correct view as possible, conventionally speaking.
Say that again, because I want to make
So
sure.
what I'm saying is, we're trying to negate something. Well, what are we negating? We are negating a concept. That concept has to be clear. We've got to have a clarity on that. But at the same time, it should be according towards the reality, transcending the conventional part of it, in some sense.
Actually, this is an important, you're raising an important question, because the issue is this, is like, we have to be careful and actually in various texts, Lama Tsongkhapa goes into a lot of detail about correctly identifying the object of negation, because, let's say, right, like, first of all, I'll say a few things, because I'm getting philosophical now for a moment. One point is, different philosophical tenet systems, or different schools of philosophy in Buddhism, identify the object of negation in more gross or more subtle ways. That's one point. So as you get subtler and subtler, or more advanced in the Buddhist philosophical systems, they identify something more and more subtle as the object to be negated. That's all. But then Lama Tsongkhapa points out, and His Holiness points out, we have to also be careful, because what we're not negating, you have to be careful that you're not, there are things that actually do exist conventionally, that are correct, and we're not negating that also. Right, so what we have to also be careful of is that we have to be, this is the tricky part, in a way, is if sometimes people will have one mistake people can make in finding the object of negation is ending up negating what does exist conventionally, which would then be nihilism, actually. In other words, so if I say I'm negating all existence of anything, right, that would actually be cultivating a nihilistic view, which is actually the worst mistake one can make in understanding emptiness. So, in a sense, to have a correct understanding of emptiness, one has to, in terms of identifying the object of negation, it has to, on the one hand, you have to negate enough so that you're actually eliminating ignorance, but not negate so much that you're negating what actually does exist, which is creating a new kind of ignorance, right? Which would be creating a kind of nihilistic or overly negative perspective. Does that make sense? Does that get at your point?
So we're saying simple negation without any leftovers. Like, for example, self, we say doesn't inherently exist, but we also come up with a feeling that it does exist convincingly.
So start with this. I mean, first of all, yes, in terms of at the point of negation, but here we're not yet negating. We're like at the preliminary stage, right? So, in a way, when you're identifying the object of negation, like actually, I'll share a story. Actually, I remember Kenshin Rinpoche telling this story. It must have been. He said it was in Tibet. So when they were young, he was like a young monk, and it was with Trijang Rinpoche, who was His Holiness Dalai Lama, one of his tutors. Right? And the monks went up so they were in Tibet, so they went like near the monastery on like a mountain, and there was like a I guess there was like a road with like cliff. There was a cliff there, and so they would. He was describing this. So that one monk would stand by the edge of the cliff, and other monks would hold him, and then he would move forward as if to fall off the cliff, and it was safe because somebody was holding him. But this feeling would arise, right, of fear and an extremely kind of concrete feeling of I, would arise in your chest, right? If you feel like I'm about to fall off a cliff, this thing that felt like very, like, it almost feels like, what's the word, like a rock in the middle of your chest, right? This kind of very concrete feeling. And then immediately that monk would sit down to meditate. That concrete feeling would become the object of negation for that monk, right? Then he would sit down and meditate, and doing the analysis we're about to go into. That was their way of identifying the object of negation in their own experience, right? So you get the feeling there, it's not something philosophical. It was this concrete feeling in their body, actually, in their mind, both, a feeling of like, I, right? That was very solid. Or sometimes they use, this doesn't give this in this one, but many texts give this example of you think of a time like when you were wrongly accused of something, right? So you didn't do it, and then somebody said to you, like, started, like, what's the word, being angry at you, saying, like, how dare you do this and that, right? And again, if you think of that kind of feeling, right? So in other words, where you feel, like, because if you did it, you might feel some, like, embarrassment or something. But if you didn't do it, then there's this very strong feeling that arises. What are you talking about? I didn't do it, and you may say that, or at least it comes up in your, again, like, usually for most people, it comes up in their chest. That feeling could come other places. It's not always in the chest. But it's like a very concrete, strong feeling in yourself, right? Like, how dare you accuse me of that? Right? You don't know what you're talking about. That kind of feeling. And so again, like, you then sit down to meditate on that. Does that make sense? There's a tradition in Tibet, right? That started unique to Tibet. It was started in Tibet, where they would go like so they would go to a cemetery in the middle of the night, and get scared, and then that feeling of they would they would actually call forth. There's a prayer. They would call forth any demons or monsters or, until they got scared. The point in a way was to get scared, right? And then they would have that feeling of I there in their chest, right? Which would come very strongly if you're in the middle of
So like when I was listening to the sound, so is the word object negation the sound or the anger I'm getting from hearing the sound?
Good question. Actually, so it's a good question, right? Because the sound is not the object of negation. That exists.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas your ears are hearing sound. That's not it. Right? But actually, you have to check what's underlying the anger, right? Like, so underlying the anger usually is a feeling of I, or is always a feeling of I, right? So it's a feeling of I don't want that sound, right? So actually, that's what you would look at here. In other words, who's the I that doesn't want that sound? You see? So actually, you wouldn't negate the sound, because that would be too much. I was saying, like, we have to be careful what we're negating, right? Like, in this case, I'm using the example of the self, right? So, because somebody says to start with, when you're meditating on emptiness, he says, there are many examples here. You can meditate on emptiness of an object. We could meditate on the emptiness of sound, but I'll start with the I, right? So actually, in that sense, we have to check, like, so, when something that we feel is unpleasant is happening, right? Again, you have to find there's a feeling of I that feels, what's the word? Truly, there are different terms, truly existent, or solid, or independent, or ultimately, as only says, the ultimate meaning is inherently existent. Right? That feels, so in this case, so if your example would be feeling that sound shouldn't be there, right? So it's that I that feels that, right? Then that becomes your object of meditation, the object of negation. So we're looking at our own experience, right? So in this sense, it's funny, right? One point that this Holiness makes is, when you're feeling very calm and peaceful, it's quite difficult to identify the object of negation. So he says, actually, it's easier to identify it when something difficult is happening. So actually, in that sense, if you really want to meditate on emptiness, then you might feel, oh, good, there's a sound that's like bothering me, or something, right? Then it helps me meditate on emptiness. Or, oh, good, there's a person accusing me wrongly. Now I get to meditate on emptiness. Like, because it clarifies our ignorance, actually, right? That grasps at a self. And because somebody says that, in other words, when our mind is very peaceful, let's say it right, like, because actually, someone makes a point there. I think he calls it. There's a mere I that does exist. Right? Somebody say a merely labeled I, a merely designated I that does exist. Actually, it's correct. And then there's this grasping we have at an independent I, or an inherently existent I, or an I that exists in a way that's more than merely labeled. Right? And so, if you're just like, if you're sort of calmly sort of looking at the clouds going by, it's very difficult to experientially identify your own sense of the inherently existent I. So oftentimes, and as long as let's say this point, so we need something oftentimes that sort of does bring it up more strongly in order to say, oh, that's what I'm trying to negate. Does that make sense? So we need something like a sound that we don't like, and that's really helpful. Or some other thing that, you know, luckily there are a lot of things, because we are ignorant beings, there are many things that will agitate us or upset us, and that's really good, because then we can identify the I to be meditated on to refute it. You know, the same thing, it doesn't have to be anger only. You know, when you have very strong desire for something, right? You find like, you know, like, so if you're really in a state of like deeply, what's the word, craving or grasping at something, right? Then so you don't look at for I, you know, if you're meditating on the emptiness I, you don't look at the grasping itself, you look at who's the I that really wants that. Like this. And again, it will feel very concrete. It'll feel like some truly exist, you know, it won't feel like something like a dream, right? It'll feel like, no, I really want that. And you identify that I. So I'm just giving some examples.
Lauren,
Yeah.
just to clarify, so in his example of the sound and myself
Mhm.
relating to the sound, you're saying I can also analyze the sound
Mhm.
as a, you know, I can deconstruct the sound,
Yeah.
but also as a choice. Because for me it's harder to go with the I first. I mean, if you're beginning.
Yeah, and using that point, if one were going to meditate on the emptiness of the sound, let's say, still we have to identify the object of negation first. So it would be this feeling, again, like, just to clarify, like if I were to say, because again, if you're like, we have to be careful in this sense. If you say, I'm going to negate that sound exists, that's not meditation. Emptiness, that's something else, right? Because sound does exist. But if you were to go to your own experience for a moment, right? If there's a sound that you don't like, right? And you check your own experience, because again, this is the part of introspection. You have to check your own experience. There will be a feeling of like this, like that sound, first of all, like you check your own feeling, it feels like it's real, and like it's intrinsically there and unpleasant, right? From its own side, right? Like what an unpleasant sound that is. That's the feeling, right? And then you have to stop and you say, well, wait a second. First of all, can sound be unpleasant from its own side? Right? Does sound exist from its own side? Right? And of course, the feeling, it's actually interesting, isn't it? Because the feeling is, yeah, that's an unpleasant sound, it's there. You know, you even feel, where's it coming from? Oh, over here, something like that, right? And then you identify it, that's the sound, right? And it's unpleasant or something like that. And the feeling really is like it exists and it's unpleasant from its own side, right? And then you start to meditate, right? It's only just gets about dependent origination, right? As we said, dependent origination is the meaning of emptiness, emptiness is the meaning of origination. Right? So you start to go, wait, the sound exists over there, but sound is dependent. Sound to exist as sound depends upon an ear, right? My ear, in this case, right? And it depends on, what's the word, we call it an eardrum, right? And on nerves, and so on, right? And on a brain, you know, and so on. So we start to analyze, so wait, does the sound, you know, so then you start to say, well, it felt like the sound existed there, right? Or then somewhere it was, you know, but sound exists dependently, right, upon various factors, right? And so then you start to go, well, wait, but it feels like, and then you say, but it still is an unpleasant sound, right? So is it an unpleasant sound from its own side, or am I labeling it as an unpleasant sound? You know, and then you start to analyze it, and you start to realize, oh, that unpleasant sound that I felt existed in some real concrete way, doesn't exist at all, right? Or is it's a projection, or it's a grasping at something that's not real. And his Holiness makes a profound point here. He says, if something truly exists, right, if something actually exists, then the more we analyze it, the clearer it will become. Right? That's why he says, if something is a hallucination, basically, he doesn't use that word, but if something's not real, you know, then the more we analyze it, we won't find it, actually. In other words, we'll start to realize, oh wow, I thought this thing was really there, but the more I'm analyzing it, the less clear it becomes. The less, the less clear it becomes.
So the object of negation, in a sense, would be not the source of irritation, but the irritation itself of the noise.
that's an interesting question. Not the source. The irritation
So
itself.
you have the vibrations coming into your eardrum, and somehow, in some way, it creates aversion or irritation. So would that be the object of negation?
You're getting an interesting point there. I mean, each of you, as you ask the questions, because, like, first of all, like, yes and no. In other words, yes, in the sense that the irritation itself can become. Let's say it this way, actually. Like, I'll get into, because you're raising a good point, an interesting point. So Tony makes this point, like, that for emptiness to exist, there has to be an object that's empty. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, emptiness is not independently existent either. It's not something that we go find that's like somewhere, right? It's not. It's also a dependent. Remember, the Buddhist slogan was dependent origination. So everything exists dependently. And so someone points out. So also emptiness is dependent. Like, in other words, the emptiness of a sound is dependent upon the sound, right? There's that sound is empty, right? So it means there's not an emptiness of the sound that somehow some other thing that apart from the sound. They're the same entity. And so we have to check up on something. Like, if so you could meditate using this example, right? One could meditate on. Now we've gotten three different. It's very subtle in a way. If from your own experience, right? So we got three different points though. One is who's the I, right? The I that doesn't like sound, right? So then we're meditating on the I, me, self, like myself, right? And then we're going to find the emptiness of myself, right? So emptiness means of a concrete, inherently existent self, right? Is empty of existence. Right? Then we can meditate, or we can. So that's one object, right? The object, like he says, what's this here? A phenomenon, right? So the phenomenon is myself, and then I'm going to meditate on the emptiness of myself. Then there's a second phenomenon, sound. Right? I pointed there as if it exists there, right? Not here, or not some, But so then there's the object is sound, right? And then I can meditate on the emptiness of inherently existent sound. And then you mentioned a third object, which is again correct. We could meditate on, which is irritation itself, right? So I would have to meditate on, which is a different object, right? Each one has its own, is a different object which we meditate on the emptiness of. So irritation, let's say, right? So I can identify my own experience of irritation, right? And if I see my own experience of irritation, it can seem very concrete. It does actually, doesn't it? When we're irritated, our experience, like that irritation seems very concrete and very solid, right? And then you have to check, well, is that irritation inherently existent, or did it arise due to interdependent factors? If it arose due to interdependent factors, it's empty of existing independently. So the point is, each of those is a different object, though. So we have to be careful. In other words, not careful, we have to be precise in our introspection. Does that make sense? To say, okay, which object am I going to meditate on the emptiness of? So it could be self, it could be the sound, it could be our irritation, and so on. But once we identify that, we identify the object, and then we identify how in our own experience it appears to be something intrinsically existent or inherently existent. Or one way, he sometimes gets at a very subtle point. He says, we're going a little too subtle for the moment, but I'll say it anyway because I thought it was very profound. So he says that it appears to us to exist as something more than merely labeled by our mind. Right? That's a very profound way of saying it.
Exaggeration.
Yeah, it appears as though it exists as something more than just something labeled by the mind. Wow, that's a subtle way of describing it. That's the ultimate object of negation. That's quite subtle philosophically. So that's why I say, that's why I use the example of like the person who's, being insulted, or the person who's being, near the cliff or something, right? That's a more visceral object of negation. As you get subtler and subtler, this one gets to the point where he says, that which appears as something more than what's merely labeled by the mind. Those are just different ways of describing the object of negation. But the point is we have to find it in our own experience. So whether it's the emptiness of sound, the emptiness of irritation, or the emptiness of self, you say like, okay, what's the phenomenon that I'm meditating on the emptiness of? You see what I mean? So any of those could be the correct object. Any of those could be an object that we're then going to meditate on the emptiness of. Because actually it's interesting, any existent phenomena could become the object, actually, of, that we would then look for the object of negation in. Does that make sense? But we have to differentiate, again, just be careful, we're not, whereas if we say, I'm empty, this is it right? In identifying the object of negation, though, we're not negating, we're not saying, for example, there's no sound, or there's no irritation, or there's no self at all, right? What we're saying is, we're looking at our own way of experiencing that, and we're identifying the object of negation that's there in that object, right? The projection of something as inherently existent. Does that make sense? In that irritation or sound or self, and then we're going to negate that.
So essentially, Dr. Lauren, the object of negation could be a simple thing. It's just a simple object, like in all these examples.
Yeah.
But once we identify that in our mind, and now we are in a part where we are analyzing that, meaning analytically processing it, there has to be a lot of correct view in that process when I'm analyzing that. For example, sound is impermanent. I need to have a correct view of impermanence, including the subtle impermanence, and so on and so forth. Would it be a right statement to say that you got to have a correct view at the point of analyzing this stuff? And that will be based on experience, obviously, because can't just be a factor.
In one sense, actually, I remember. In one sense, no. Actually, I'll say it that way. And I mean that in a particular way, though. Like that we actually don't have a correct view until we come to the conclusion of that analysis. Really, because the only, in this sense, the only correct view is the view of emptiness, actually. And so, until we come to the conclusion of the analysis, we never do have a correct view. And one time, Ken Rinpoche said it, until we've realized emptiness directly, we never have a correct view, actually, in one sense. In other words, until somebody has achieved the direct realization of emptiness, they've never yet had a correct view, in one sense. I mean, so I'm being extreme.
Conceptually, inference, I'm talking about, like, leaning towards.
So, yeah, so even then, though, I guess what I'd say is, until you come to the conclusion, obviously we're getting closer to a correct view as we analyze, in one sense. But then until we come to the conclusion of our, like, we don't have the inferential understanding of emptiness until we come to the conclusion of that analysis, just to be sort of precise in a way. But of course, from a practical point of view, we're getting closer as we analyze. If we're analyzing correctly, in that sense, of course, you're correct, that we're getting closer and closer. But even from the perspective of sort of gaining a correct conceptual understanding of emptiness, or correct inferential cognition of emptiness, let's say, that's a better way to put that. If we're approaching a correct inferential understanding of emptiness, we don't really have that until the conclusion of our analysis. When as long as puts it, when we said then we just sort of practice single-pointed concentration on that inferential understanding. That would be the point at which we're really cultivating the correct view. Before that, we are cultivating one in the sense that we're approaching it. But I don't know, some sort of being precise or something.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
So can an object like love become object negation?
Again, we have to be careful, right? Like, so there is because love itself exists, just as the self exists, right? Just as the sound.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's possible that if we check in our own experience and we realize, again, you have to be careful. Is it the object of love or is it the love itself? Which one?
I'm talking about the feeling.
The feeling of
which
love.
arises like.
Yeah, if you're grasping at it as something truly existent, then yeah.
Okay.
Then that could be right, because love is also empty.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, every
Because if you no longer have hatred and you have love, so you can use that feeling, right?
Yeah, that's where, like, so for example, they talk about many kinds of in Buddhist teachings. They talk about many kinds of love and compassion, and they say actually the highest form of loving compassion is there's in the praise to Lama Tsongkhapa's verse. At one point they say you are Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of non-objectifying compassion. Mm-hmm. And they say, what does non-objectifying compassion means? It means a kind of compassion that recognizes that the self that's having, let's say, the self that's being loving, the act of love itself, and the object of love are all empty of inherent existence. So in that sense, whereas the highest form of love is a kind of love that recognizes the emptiness of love.
Yeah.
So one can meditate.
So what about the one we feel when we touch somebody, like when I exaggerate somebody's beautiful, what about that kind of love?
Oh, so that's more like attachment, actually,
Yeah.
really. And that, of course, yeah, definitely. We can meditate on the emptiness. Again, you can meditate on the emptiness of the person
The
you're
person.
attached to, or on the grasping or
Grasping.
attachment itself, or on the self. Any of those you can meditate on the emptiness of.
Okay.
As we talk about the three spheres, that's the emptiness of all three. Right, so there's a recognition. They all appear to exist. This is not in this particular text, but that's one meditation on emptiness. Is you recognize each of those appears to exist inherently, but of course they're all dependent, right? In other words, the perceiver, the desirer, the act of desiring, and the object of desire exist interdependently, right? They all exist dependent upon each other, and yet they appear to exist intrinsically. So that's another way of meditating on emptiness, actually, is that. In that sense, but that's not. In English we don't really differentiate love from grasping, of course. In Buddhist psychology, they differentiate those quite clearly. But we could use whichever one, So but actually you could put both are empty though, actually, right? Grasping is empty, and loving kindness is also empty in that sense.
It's like saying the paramitas, transcendental paramitas, the same concept. Like unless all three aspects of it, you haven't really transcended the perfection part.
Yeah, exactly. Which is one of the main topics of Chandra Kirti's Majjhima Avatar, which gets ritual. So then I want to, Rajiv's question kind of leads us to the next step. So I want to point out something related to what Rajiv said, which is, so we have to first identify the object of negation, right, as I was saying, and emphasize it. Because otherwise you don't know, like I was saying, otherwise you don't know otherwise you'll come to some vague conclusion that things are empty of something, right? That's not emptiness, actually, right? Whereas you have to identify what is ignorance grasping at, and then you're going to analyze that. Does that make sense? And so then the way we do that actually is we have to, once we identify the object of negation, so I'm going to use the example of the eye, right? Just going back to it, because this only says that's the, how does he phrase it? I think he says the easiest one to begin with. He says here, if initially we meditate on the selflessness of the person, meaning ourself, it is said to be easier for meditation, because that subject is continually present for us, right? Our sense of ourself is always there. So he says, so you've always got that one to meditate on. He makes it so he says that he suggests that's easier. But so we have to first identify this object of negation in our own experience, and not, a couple points. One is not in somebody else's experience. That's not useful, right? Also, it can't just be purely theoretical. It has to actually be in your own experience. Does that make sense? So you can't say, whereas at the beginning when you're studying, of course it could be useful to go, oh wow, people of this sub-school of philosophy identify the application using this concept, and of that sub-school they identify it according to that. These different levels of subtlety. From an intellectual perspective, that's useful to understand those things. But then when you're meditating, it has to be experiential. Does that make sense? And you can then relate your experience to those different concepts in order to sort of see which one am I, how subtle is my own ability to identify it in my own experience. But it has to still be in your own experience. That's one point. Then when you meditate on the emptiness of that, you don't then forget about that, right? In other words, you have to hold that, and then with part of your mind, you're going to analyze that. Does that make sense? Because if you identify the object of negation and then you say, okay, identify that, now I'm going to forget about that and meditate on emptiness, again, you've lost the point, in a way. So you have to, I'm just trying to get on an experiential, how the experience has to work, right? Is you identify, so let's say, for example, you think of somebody, a time when you were really angry at somebody, or when somebody accused you, or when you felt threatened, and this sense of I arose very concretely in your chest. I'm giving that as an example, right? So then you have to hold on to that experience. Does that make sense? With your mind. Say, okay, that's how that feels. Now, and then you're going to say, that I, that concrete thing that's there, right, that inherently existent sense of myself, is that real or is it not real? Does that make sense? That's the question. And so then His Holiness presents, and it's amazing, his text is only 24 pages, but His Holiness presents many, many different ways, quite a lot of different ways of analyzing whether or not that self exists, right? And then he does the same thing for external objects also, or other things than self, right? And so I'll just go, maybe we can go through a few different examples of those ways of analyzing. Does that make sense? But you understand the point, though, because it's not useful if you don't understand the point that first you have to identify the object of negation that then you're going to use these reasonings to check on, right? Because remember what I said? This only points out very clearly twice in this text, actually, where he says, you know, if something is truly existent, then when you analyze it deeply, it'll become clearer and clearer, right? Whereas if something's like if something is a non-existent object of ignorance, then the more you analyze it, the more you'll start to feel like, wow, I'm not so sure it even exists at all. Does that make sense? But, so that's the point, right, of these analyses. And so then, so while holding on to that, so I'm just going to go through one example. There are many examples this one gives, many different reasonings, which he mainly takes from other sources, mostly texts by Arya Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. Those are the two main sources, actually, for the ones that he always presents. But so one method that he always uses here is having identified the object of negation, right, which is this concrete, in this case, we're saying this concrete sense of I. And this is on page 11, I'm just using this one as an example. The emptiness, so that one notices, right, okay, so this I feels quite concrete, right? Feels like something intrinsically existent, or inherently existent, or independently existent. These are different terms that are used to describe the experience, right? And then one analyzes, this one is based on parts. Right? So somebody says, okay, so then check up, right? Does that I, that self, like, so first of all, does it exist on the parts of the body? Right? You start checking, right? This is where you start analyzing. Right? So you start going, well, like, does it exist on my hair? Well, I got them cut, so it doesn't, you know, they fell off, and my sense of self I didn't leave it behind at the barber shop or something, right? Does it exist on my fingers? Is the self there? Is that myself, the finger, right? And you know, you go through, right? And then you can start saying, like, and then you start, you know, if you start to do that, then you start to, well, it's in my chest, right? So maybe it's on my heart, right? So you can check, well, is it in like the right ventricle? Is that myself? Or is it the left ventricle? Or is it the blood that's going through? Or is it the aorta? And you start thinking of those. And actually, if you check in your own experience, you'll start to go, well, no, those are kind of like pieces of muscle and meat. Actually, that's not myself. Like, right? Well, is it the lungs? You know, well, is the left lung, is the right lung, right? And they have like all the parts to them as well, right? Subparts, right? They're made up of different cells. So is there some cell in the lung that's myself? Obviously not. It becomes silly, obviously not. Right? And so you analyze first based on the body, and you can recognize that thing, this I that I was feeling, that feels intrinsically existent. If you check in your own experience, you know, and the same thing with the brain, right? You can go through and you can say, like, again, there are many parts of the brain, and there are like, actually the brain itself is, you know, like, we even to say parts of the brain is a little bit silly, of course, because what actually is of course these networks of interrelated neuronal connections, right? Which are constantly having neurotransmitters and so on moving between them. You know, and so you say, so is some part of, is some one movement of a neurotransmitter the self, or is some one connection? You know, like the nerve has then many different connections that connect to other many connections. So you're trying to analyze, is the self somewhere one of those connections? And, you know, so you analyze all the different parts, right, of your body, and so you come to some experiential, you're staying with this experience of a self that's here, right? And you're going, well, it's not the left ventricle, it's not the right ventricle, it's not the aorta, it's not the, you know, it's not those little sacs in the lung, and it's not, certainly not the bone here, right? When they cut, I have a friend, right, when they cut his bone to do heart surgery, the self didn't disappear. When they replace somebody's, you know, valve with a pig valve, they don't become a different person, right? They don't become a pig at that point. Their sense of self actually stays just the same, you know, just as concrete. It's not the same, it changes, but just as concrete. So you analyze and you say, okay, so if you analyze enough experientially, again, staying with that one experience, the experience of the I, right? And then you're checking all those different parts of your body, you eventually come to an experiential recognition, yeah, that's not that. It's not there on the body. And actually, if you do that, right, what will happen in your own experience will be, you'll feel, because you're still grasping at the I, right, you'll recognize, okay, it's not there on the body, must be the mind, right, because you're like, because you don't, it doesn't let go that easily, right? So somebody says, okay, so then you analyze the mind, right? And it always makes this a point where he says, So what is the mind, right? And he says, so then you check the mind. So the mind exists over time, as the example he gives, right? So that's another way of analyzing parts is temporally, right? And so you say, so does this I that feels concrete in my chest here, is it the mind of the past? And so you check, like, well, actually this feels present, so my mind from 2 weeks ago isn't this. Right? That makes sense. That's clear. That's obvious. So is my mind just from yesterday? Maybe it's 2 weeks ago. It's too far away. So it's yesterday's mind is this. Well, no, yesterday's mind is gone. Right? It doesn't. It's not findable anymore. But this feels present. So okay, it's not that. Right? Well, how about 8 seconds ago's mind? Right? So you check experientially, right? No, that's past, right? And then you start to get to, well, 1 second ago's mind. No, that's past. And then is the future mind? That doesn't exist yet, so it can't be a self that exists independently, right? And then someone makes this point, so you try to find, is there some present mind that's it? And then he says, but if you check, and again, this isn't just intellectual, it has to be experiential, but that you can't find a present mind that doesn't include, or it's, if you try to grasp the present mind, as you're grasping it's already past. Right? And if you try to grasp the future mind, it stops to be the future, it becomes the present and then the past. And you can't find something that's intrinsically present. Does that make sense? Because the mind itself is what's there to say, right? You find, what's there to say, how,
Continue.
it's a continuum, that's the word I was getting the word, continue. It's a continuum, right? And he says here, is divided into individual moments. There is no mass that is a composite of the many former and later moments, right? Whereas you can't find something concrete, right, that exists in some stable way that is the mind, right? And if the mind exists as something merely labeled, as we can say, that's my mind, it existed. In other words, from a conceptual perspective, I could say, my mind existed yesterday, and yesterday I was feeling happy, and today I'm sad, but tomorrow I'll feel better, right? We can say that. And verbally that means something if I'm saying it to a friend, right? But if I try to find something that actually is my mind, that existed then and exists now and will exist tomorrow, you can't find it. Okay.
So I think the same can be applied to time in my meditation. Like it can be an external object.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Guardian teaches that. I think in Wisdom. And so I'll make a point here. So then next question. So the point is, I was getting at is if you analyze, right, looking for that I, and then you're checking, it's not in my, or as I check my body, it's not there, right, that concrete I. I check the mind, and it's not there, right? Then you start to have the experience of, let's say right. You begin to get the feeling that self that I'm grasping at, and maybe at the beginning it's probably just a question. Maybe it doesn't exist at all. Maybe that really isn't real, that inconcrete self. Eventually, of course, the goal is to come to an actual conclusion, a recognition, an inferential cognition. That concrete, independent, inherently existent self doesn't exist, actually. You see, this is one method, the beginning method of analyzing. I'm just giving that one as an example, right? So it's searching the body and mind. Go ahead.
You're saying that mind is dynamic, but I think what I understand is that you can bring the past into the present through memory, and also you can probably bring the future into the present through imagination. So don't you create a mindset when you do that?
Say what you mean by mindset, just to be clear, like just so I understand. Like when you say a mindset, say what you mean. Like,
let's say the object of negation is strong resentment. So you're probably gonna rely on your memory, so you're bringing the past into your present. And you create a mindset at that point where you investigate and you do your introspection.
That's true, first of all, yeah, so that's great. And I guess part of what we're getting at here is, we have to, actually you're raising another good point, which is, Sonis gets at this point in the text here, where he says, we also have to differentiate conventional existence from ultimate analysis. That's what the way I think Sonis puts it. And so the point there is this, is if we don't analyze, like from an ultimate perspective, then we can just say, you know, so let's say if I were to say, your example, right? If I were to say, you know, I was thinking about what somebody did, you know, this incident with somebody from years ago, and I felt very resentful. Like from a conventional point of view, that's true. I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth, right? If that happened, you know. So you're saying, and if you're not analyzing from an ultimate perspective, then you would just say, yeah. Or it's like, so let's say you were talking to a friend. You said, I was thinking about this incident from many years ago, and what somebody did, and I felt very resentful. That's a correct discussion, right? From a conventional perspective, and your friend would say, oh wow, that's terrible, or I'm sorry you had to feel that way, or whatever, you know, like, and there's no, but then it's only makes this point, he says, so that's, because a conventional discourse, in a sense, you're not, when you're having that level of discourse, you're not engaging in ultimate analysis, that's the word. But then he's saying, when you start to engage in ultimate analysis, that's a different question. Because then what you're asking is, okay, so, like, so for example, if I were to then, let's say I'm using that example, right? Then I say, so first I'm having a conventional level of discussion. Oh, so years ago this person did this, I remembered it, I felt upset. That's conventional. And you say, okay, you know, sorry that happened. But now I'm going to engage in ultimate analysis, right? So in ultimate analysis, I'm going to say, let's say, so for example, the mind that feels resentful, in this case, feels like it's truly existent, inherently existent. Now I'm engaging in a different question. The question is, does that mind truly exist in that way or not? Right? Now when I start to analyze that, then it becomes an ultimate analysis question. And then I would say, okay, well, the mind that feels resentment now, is it the same mind? Is it identical to the mind that existed 5 years ago when this incident happened? Well, no, the mind of 5 years ago is gone. In other words, the past is past. You know, so that mind doesn't exist. You know, and then you would say, so it doesn't. One example. This is one way of analyzing. Actually, that's a different method here. But so you say, is it identical to that mind? Obviously not. Right? In other words, 5 years ago, I was younger. I was, whatever. You know, I had more energy. I had something. Whatever. There are many differences, right? Then you say, so is it? So it's not. It's not the same. Then you say, well, then is it intrinsically different than that mind of 5 years ago? Well, if it's intrinsically different, I couldn't remember it, right? Or they're relational somehow, right? Or so they can't be inherently different minds, because then, what's they say? Right? Then there would be no relationship, and then I couldn't say, oh, that happened to me, or my mind is upset about something from the past, right? There has to be, so you can't say they're inherently the same. You can't say they're inherently different, right? So did this mind, so if this mind came from that mind, right, if it truly existent present mind came from the past mind, then they have to be the same or they have to be different. Right? But neither one makes, if I analyze, they're not the same. And they're also not intrinsically different, right? So you start to say, so in what sense how does this mind in the present exist? Right? It becomes a different question, right? So what I'm getting at is the conventional level. You say you don't ask that question. You just say, yeah, I was upset then, and I feel resentful. Right? But then when you do this ultimate analysis, if you analyze it, you come to the conclusion, well, this present mind is unarisen. Actually, is the phrase they use. Whereas it didn't arise from itself. It didn't arise from something different. It's not inherently existent. In other words, it doesn't truly exist in the way I'm perceiving it. That's the conclusion. So it's two different levels of discussion in a way. The conventional, you don't ask that question. But in the ultimate, when you do ask that question, then you come to this recognition that the independently existent or intrinsically existent mind that I feel exists as resentful, you come to the conclusion that intrinsically existent mind doesn't exist actually. Right? That's the result of the ultimate analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Lauren,
Okay.
you have to come to the four extreme conclusions, saying not by itself, not by other, not by both, or by any causes.
Yeah, so that one.
For every phenomenon that we are investigating. If it's
So-
temporal, then we go along those lines. And if it's by parts, we go by the pathless dimension.
One point, actually, it's interesting, oftentimes the one, that's what I was referring, right? It doesn't exist, it didn't arise from itself, didn't, and so on, not from both and not from neither. Usually that's presented as a way of analyzing phenomena. In other words, so, in other words, not the cell. They usually present that not as they usually, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, to be honest, myself, but, because I sometimes like using that. Personally, I find it interesting to use that one as well for the self, but they recommend that one is mainly used for the meditation on objects, like so the mind, or the body, or external object, like the cushion. But they suggest using that method to meditate on the emptiness of objects, or phenomena, they call it. That's oftentimes a recommendation. So that's one of the, and I'm just going through, what we're starting to touch on is there are many different reasonings or methods, right, to meditate on emptiness here. So, one I gave was looking at the parts, right? Another one we gave is the emptiness of causality, right? Did it arise from itself? Did it arise from other? Did it arise from both? Or did it arise from causelessly, right? That's the one. So those are two. There are many others, right? Dependent origination in general. And what Sonia says is, of course, they all come down to dependent origination as the ultimate method of meditating on emptiness. But so there are many different, there are many different ways of reasoning to analyze, does this object of negation exist or not? And so these are some examples we're starting to touch on. Does that make sense? And so that's what you're, okay.
Somebody had a question.
No, but, oh yeah, you had.
Just we're talking about the mind time,
Mind, time? Yeah,
past,
present.
future. Brings me the problem of dealing with the concept of time into the emptiness too.
Mhm.
And with the idea that, of course, in order to contemplate emptiness and to bring the conscience to analyze and to be aware of the phenomena, which is very difficult because if we are not aware of our body as a phenomenon, it's very difficult when we see phenomena outside the body. We don't realize that. So it's more difficult to see our body as a phenomenon itself. But this brings me with the time is the immediate, the second that the phenomena appears in front of us, that the illness, which is, let's say, part of life, but not sometimes reality. But the one of the examples you give, all you say about this, if we don't have result of that, it's easy to contemplate and to let it go. Problem, I think, and that comes with it, is two things. First, to deal with the time of analysis of the phenomena. When I say that is, in the moment that the phenomena occurs, how to deal with that. Of course, you have to be prepared and meditate and reflect on that. But even like that, the time that the phenomena appears doesn't give it enough space to contemplate the phenomena for the painful. And then I think it has to
Like a
do-
physical pain or illness or hurt. Or something.
or for example, you have been accused, you say,
Right.
but the result of that, all the things that could derive from that, could be really tough.
Mhm.
So the time and the time to analyze that suddenly or abruptly phenomena appear and to think about the emptiness is quite very difficult.
Yeah.
So, of course, in Cartesian way, we cannot just let it go eyes and ears and touch and smell and everything, which is very, very difficult. How we can deal with that time concept of the emptiness in terms of phenomena occurrence immediately.
Like when it's actually happening experientially.
Exactly, because we will have the time to contemplate afterwards.
Yeah, yeah.
Something happened to me in the past, okay, I have let it go. And I understand all the components. Problem is the time frame. I've seen that as a it's a very interesting problem that deals, I mean, if you deal with emptiness, you will have the time to contemplate and to analyze all the component phenomena. But the time frame to occur the phenomenon, that's something that, how to deal with that. That's, I don't know. It's,
I get what you're saying, yeah, that makes sense.
Awareness.
That is, part of what's getting right it's quite difficult, right? And there is, obviously, right? There's something very challenging happens in the moment. It's quite difficult to say, oh, it's empty, yeah, that's quite true, isn't it? And about that, first of all, I think it's valid, you're making a good point, it's not easy. And I guess I'll say this, like, a couple points, like, one is, actually, I'll share, like, share something, connecting something that Ken Rinpoche has mentioned, and also the point His Holiness makes in his text. Sometimes Ken Rinpoche points this out, he says, for somebody who's gained, even like, first of all, for somebody who's gained a direct realization of emptiness, that's quite easy. Even for somebody who's gained like a correct inferential realization of emptiness. Then Ken Rinpoche says, then for that person, as they have negative experiences or difficult things happen, he says, for that person, the mental afflictions are light, and it's like they're not completely beyond them, but he says they're light, and they experience the phenomenon as almost dreamlike, kind of dreamlike. But then, of course, for us, if we don't have that, then it's not so easy. So part of the answer to that question is like, actually, it's really true. If you look even at the teachings on the stages and levels, and there's the levels one goes to in the Buddhist path of practice, particularly in relation to emptiness, is there are very advanced levels, right, where they describe like people on the, for example, people who have on the bodhisattva bhumis, the bodhisattva levels, where they have things, where they have like, there's famous stories where somebody who's, where like they're being physically attacked and their arms being chopped off and they can recognize the emptiness at that time. But that's quite an advance, that's a person who's realized emptiness directly previously. So they're not first realizing it at that moment. But then like for ordinary us, like ordinary people who don't have that level of realization, right? It's a very valid question you're raising, is how do you apply this when difficult things arise? And so I guess a few things, like one is, it's true actually, isn't it, that there is the more we put emphasis into these practices, is at the beginning we have to start, as you described, with things that from the past, right? And with things that are less charged for us, that where we're not overwhelmed. And so that's why, like they say in these examples, right, like, oh, think of a time from the past when somebody accused you, or think of a time from the past when, or something like that, because for us, it's like we're overwhelmed actually by our mental afflictions. It's the truth, right? We get when something like is triggering them, they are like a flood. They overwhelm us, and at that time, then we don't have enough mental clarity to meditate on emptiness experientially, oftentimes. And so I think the process actually, from a time perspective, and then this is my own reflection for a moment, is I think part of the goal in a way for us as beginners is, at the beginning, like we can say, okay, something that's quite, like what's the word? You have to start with something that's like either fairly, quite distant temporally, or maybe not such a big deal, to us, because we can like sort of feel the sense of the object of negation, but also not be overwhelmed. And then like slowly, I think we can get, His Holiness actually says at one point, he says like, if it used to be like that we would be angry about something for 3 weeks, and then we can get to the point where it's 2 weeks, that's big progress, His Holiness puts that out, and then eventually we get to the point where it's like 1 week, wow, like that's a third, that's like huge progress, So I think we have to like, and so to me, I guess like, and actually it's making me think of just my own one, I'll share one experience myself, like I remember when I was, sometimes I would meditate on emptiness at night, and there would come to a point where like, I could see the object of negation from like earlier in that day, and I remember like, sometimes I would just start laughing, like, I was believing that would like, you start going like, wow, I actually was really feeling like this was true, but it was, my mind was making it up, or like, you start to recognize that, right? And then you can almost laugh like, how silly, that is. And then I remember thinking, well, that's nice, but I didn't do it at the moment. It took till that night, to do it. But I was like, okay, well, that's fine. Again, I was like Sonia said, well, that's progress. It's better than a week later, or a month later, or a year later. It's like, okay, at least it's that night. So I think part of it is like we have to try to like get closer and closer to that. But then, so the time frame, I think, at the beginning it has to be distant, and then we try to sort of get closer and closer to being able to apply it in the moment. But then in relation to that, I'll share one more thought I have, which is when I was reading Solis' text, and then I was looking, so Solis gives us advice about how to really progress in the understanding of emptiness, at the very end of the text, actually. And he says, after describing all these points about it, how to identify obligation, and then various reasonings, right, to refute it, then he says, he gives some practical advice. He says, at the beginning, we should meditate for half an hour on emptiness, right? He says, when we arise from the session, right, the various good and bad objects appear, benefit and harm are manifestly experienced. Therefore, we should develop as much as we can the realization that these phenomena do not exist objectively and are mere dependent arisings of appearances, like illusions. Right? But then Solis makes a point. He says, if we want to make progress now, he's saying, this is kind of funny, he says, we should meditate in this way in 4 formal sessions, at sunrise, in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening. Or if possible, we should meditate in 6 or 8 or more sessions, scheduling them at equal intervals throughout the day and the night. And then he says at minimum 2, but he says ideally, 4 or 6 or 8. And so I was reading that, and I was going, oh, okay, that's how, there is, if you imagine imagine a person who 8 times a day is stopping to meditate for a half hour on emptiness, of course, and if that person is doing that, and then he says, and while doing that, cultivate calm abiding, So one starts to, and then Solis is getting at, if somebody really wants to make progress, then of course it's only saying that will lead to much faster progress, right? Because it's more, 2 things though. One is it's more, of course, more time, but also what he's getting at, I think, is like, you're then forcing yourself to apply emptiness over and over again throughout the day. I remember Kenshiro making the same point, saying like, if like 6 times a day you could bring to mind bodhicitta and then bring to mind emptiness, then you'll see a change over time. It'll help your mind very quickly, whereas if it's once a day, it's not going to be as noticeable, the change. So I think His Holiness is saying, and then His Holiness is saying, and at the same time, of course, study the text on emptiness. He's saying if you really want to progress, he's saying, study the treatises on emptiness and do this at least twice a day, or 4 times a day, or 6 or 8. So I think the issue there is like, is like how much we can apply it, or how powerful. It's like an antidote, actually. Meditation on emptiness is the antidote to the problem. But in other words, how, it's like, it's like if to use that metaphor for a moment of an antidote, like if I have like a terrible infection, but I only have a very weak antibiotic and just 1 dose, it's not going to work, Whereas if I have a very powerful if I think it's like this, if I apply to myself, I have such powerful mental afflictions that I need like an intravenous antibiotic or something to overcome that one. Which is kind of what His Holiness is suggesting here, right? Like, continue like a kind of continuous dose of the cure. And so, I remember like Lama Zorinpoche pointing that out, like saying like, oh wow, like, when he would see people who had really, some Tibetan masters, for example, where like, he gave the example where like as the person was, as the thing was happening, like the person fell down a flight of stairs or something, and as they were falling down the flight of stairs, they were recognizing emptiness, something like that. Where you're like, oh wow, that's somebody, and he was saying that's somebody who's well trained. Of course, that person is really familiar, their mind is infused with that understanding. But that only happens through this kind of level of habituation that His Holiness is saying. And it's like, otherwise, it won't happen, actually, is the point. And actually, I'll just say one more reflection on that, just my own reflection. Just because the other day I was thinking about this. In the teachings on the stages and paths, there's a point before the direct realization of this, where the person is getting closer and closer to that direct realization. And they have like, they talk about it as like, you give rise to, the understanding of emptiness, it says, gradually they give rise to what are called 5 powers and then 5 strengths. But part of the essence of that I was just reflecting on myself is how like, what happens is that as the person gets more and more familiar with emptiness and closer to realizing it and so on, then like their understanding of emptiness gains the power or the strength to overcome the mental afflictions more. Does that make sense? And part of what I was like, what I was reflecting on actually is like, oh, so until you reach that level, they don't have that much strength. Of course, you know, it's weaker because we're not familiar with it. You know, it's not as, we don't have as much experience to apply, and so that's why Sonus is saying we have to develop this kind of familiarity, and through that familiarity, it'll help us overcome the mental afflictions, and we'll become happy. That's the point. But it's not easy, of course, because if we're busy and we're, you know, distracted, then of course that's a different challenge. That's another challenge.
Dr. Lord, what are the 5 powers and 5 strengths?
Oh, let's.
Clairaudience and clairvoyances and stuff.
Oh no, that's different. Those are the 5. I mean that's the those are the clairvoyances or the.
Calm abiding.
Yeah, those are from. These are. Oh gosh, I forgot the list of them right now. It might be in here. I'll look it up later and share it with you. But those are particular to where one's realization or the inner strength of one's practice becomes more effective at overcoming the mental afflictions. That's what's being. So those other ones that you were mentioning are more for helping others actually, like the clairvoyance and so on. Comfort. Those are like results of meditation that one uses to help others, whereas these what I was referring to are more like inner powers that help one overcome one's own mental afflictions. Really. I can't remember the list right now, but I used to know it. Other questions, or I can go back to a couple more points about reasoning.
Dr. Lauren, I would like you to expound a little more, if you could, on emptiness of production and emptiness on casuality. Those 2 things.
Which page is it?
Page number 12.
Oh, production and causality. Okay.
Yeah. The production is the one that I kind of get confused when we say there's no production, and I just wanted to have your thought on that.
Okay. So these, as I was saying, so okay, emptiness of production, so we're on page 12, 13. So as I was saying a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, this is often used to meditate on the emptiness of phenomena. And this one, actually, I'll share just a personal reflection on this. I think one can understand, right now we'll talk about it, obviously, like, sort of verbally, you know, we'll talk about what they're saying, but Jeffrey Hopkins actually says, and I think he's correct, it was helpful to me when he pointed out, is that one has to sort of apply this over and over again experientially to start to actually understand what this one's getting at, really. But the idea is this, is so somebody says here, somebody says, I'll start with the first, I'm just going to read the first sentence or two. Somebody says, the Dalai Lama says, just as it is widely known that an effect is produced from causes, so production does exist conventionally. Right? So he's starting with this differentiation of as we were talking about, the ultimate level analysis and the conventional. So he's saying, conventionally, of course, we all know that effects come from causes, right? In other words, like, you know, in other words, and that's obvious, in other words, on a worldly level, right? When he says conventionally, it means like on a worldly level, right? Whereas that's why, you know, farmers plant seeds and produce crops. They don't just like not bother planting the seed and think the crop's going to come, right? And the same way, you know, like, you know, as we all know this, right? You know, we don't skip going to the grocery store thinking food will suddenly magically appear in our home. So on a conventional worldly level, it's obvious that there is, what's the word? That things are produced from causes. Like there is our dinner doesn't appear on the stove causelessly, right? Like we just walk downstairs in the evening and say, oh, where's my dinner? Gosh, I'm surprised it's not there. I didn't produce any of the causes, but I'm surprised there's no result of a dinner on my table. So that's obvious, right? That's what somebody is getting up there. And he's saying, and on a worldly, conventional level, if you know, when we're not engaging in ultimate analysis, right, as I was differentiating, then of course we know that you have to produce the causes to get the results. Does that make sense? In the same way, right? Like we know that, you know, same thing. Like, you know, somebody doesn't think like, oh wow, I'm going to get paychecks if I don't have a job and go to work, right? Like, these are all obvious worldly. But then it's saying, however, let us analyze the meaning of production, right? So there he's saying, let's engage in ultimate analysis. Does that make sense? Because all phenomena are empty, right? Is what the Buddhist teaching is. And so he's saying, here we're getting at, is production itself empty, right? That's the analysis. So now production is the object of and we have to differentiate something. We're not trying to refute all production. Because things are produced. He already said that, right? what we're trying to get at is you have to identify the object of negations. The object of negation here is some feeling that there's a truly existent or independent or inherently existent production. Does that make sense? That things exist in some inherent way, that therefore they're inherently produced, right? So you would start with like a phenomenon, right? Like so, and actually, if you were going to really do this one, right, experientially, you might start with something you're attached to. You know, it's like your favorite object in your house, for example, right? Like, so, or something that you really feel some grasping at, you know, something like that. Or your house itself, you know, your car or whatever. Something that you really feel like, again, we're going back to your example, like, if your car were, if you went outside and you found your car, you know, destroyed by a sledgehammer, you would get upset. You know, and that object, suddenly you would have some kind of strong feeling, right, of upset. You know, so where you have grasping at the object, that's my point, right? And then you would feel that object truly exists, and it was produced, and it's here, you know, and it exists in some concrete way, and it exists intrinsically from its own side. That's the feeling. Does that make sense? So that's the object of negation, is this idea of like a sort of truly existent or inherently existent product, right? And it's a product, right? It's produced. Okay, so then you're going to analyze, right? And so now, this one is actually quite profound, but also difficult. So that's why it makes sense you ask. It's a difficult one. And so it always goes through four. So it always says, if now you're going to do the analysis, right? So this is the method of analysis. So you're saying, okay, I mean, whatever, this object, the car, or the vase, or the whatever, house, or something, you know, feels like it was, you know, it's a real product. It's really there. It was produced, and it's really intrinsically existent. So you're going to analyze. So the analysis, while holding that feeling of intrinsic or inherently existent product, is you then analyze if it's a truly existent product, there are only four possibilities. Makes sense? There are four ways a product could be produced. And it always goes through them in a particular order here. So the first one is, so he says first causelessly, right? Which is the last one in Nagarjuna's quote at the end here. But anyway, so first thing is, so let's take a house. I'll just use that as the example, as a product. Right? Clearly, we know a house is a product. It doesn't exist. It's not there aren't houses that appear. So the first thing is, could it be causeless? Or is it possible that somehow this house appeared? Nobody built it. Nobody put the stones or the wood or the nails. You know, and that one is always points out. He starts with that because he says that, well, that's silly, right? In other words, anybody can recognize. Obviously, in this example of the product as a house, houses don't come about causelessly, right? In other words, it's not like nobody made the nails and nobody made the wood and nobody made the stones and nobody laid the foundation. Like that, we can easily see. Anybody can recognize that. So we can, of the four possibilities, we can eliminate causeless production, right? That's easy to eliminate. Right? Then it's only says there's a second possibility. We're going through four. There are only four, right? Actually, I'll say what the four are, right? So the four are causeless production, production from itself, production from something other, or both self and other. Does that make sense? So okay, so we can eliminate causeless. That's clear. So now you're saying, okay, so I have this feeling of intrinsically existent product, my house. Obviously, I can eliminate it wasn't produced causelessly. That's gone. Right? Now, the second one is, I'm doing the order His Holiness does it. Second one is produced from itself. Right? And so that's somehow like that the house built itself, right? That it already existed before. The idea there would be that somehow the house existed before it existed, right? And that therefore it's a product of itself. Does that make sense? And there, again, you could say, well, first of all, and it only says here, first of all, it would be purposeless. In other words, that's a meaningless statement, right? In other words, because if it already existed before it existed, then it already existed, so it didn't have to produce itself, right? So that's meaningless. One point it's making is that'd be an utterly meaningless statement, right? That something produced itself, as if the house sort of built itself, right? In other words, if the house didn't have to build itself because it already existed. Does that make sense? And then secondly, you know, and he says, for that what has already attained its own entity to be produced again is a meaningless thing, right? That's one point. Does that make sense? And another is, if things produce themselves, then they would just keep producing themselves, and they would sort of fill the whole universe with themselves, right? Like so, if somehow this house were producing itself, one point is that's meaningless because it already existed. Another point is if houses sort of magically kept producing themselves, you know, then it would sort of be producing houses everywhere, and the entire universe would be filled with my house, and that's obviously also not true, right? So things don't, as we can see in our own analysis, things don't produce themselves, and he gives two different reasons why that's the case. And so so from that, yeah, things he says here, there's the fallacy that reproduction would happen endlessly, right? There is so he's pointing out two ridiculous consequences, right, of production of himself. You get them? One is it already existed, its entity already existed, so it's silly to say it then produced itself because it already existed. And the other is it would produce itself endlessly and the universe would become filled with that. Obviously that's not how things work. So I can eliminate production from self. Then he gets to the next one, which is production from other. Right? And this is actually of the four. This one is it's quite important, but it's a little bit probably the hardest one, I think. And so he says here, if effects were produced from entities other than themselves, they would be produced from everything, both from what is considered conventionally to be their causes and from what are not, since both are equally other. So what he's getting at here is this, is if, again, because he's getting at the object of negation was intrinsic or inherent production, right? And so he's saying, if the things that produce a house were inherently other than a house, right? Produce from other means inherently other. Then that's silly. Because first of all, if they're inherently other than the house, they can't make up the house, right? They can't be part of a house. And also then anything would come from anything, right? In other words, then I could I could throw my pen in the air and expect that to produce a house, right? Because anything should be able to produce anything. I know a pen's other than a house, why can't it produce a house, right? So in other words, if things were, and part of the implication of this is things that, if something were intrinsically existent, right? I just want to analyze this one a little more. So if the house were intrinsically existent as a house, right? Then it has to come from something else that's intrinsically existent that's not a house, right? That's other, right? And so then they're disconnected, actually, right? There's part of what he's getting is then there's no connection between those
Separate
things.
entities.
Separate entities, right? And if they're separate entities, it can't, there is a thing saying that, first of all, it can't come from that, or anything should be able to produce anything then, right? Like anything should arise from anything, because if separate entities could give rise to themselves, then babies should come from microphones, so to speak.
Seed and sprout, like
yeah,
apple tree.
they're not relational, right? And then he says, the last possibility is both self and other, right? There's maybe things arise from both from themselves and from other. And then it always points out, of course, that if we've already shown there's that an intrinsically existent object like a house, that would mean. He says that would actually be in some way, he doesn't say this, but actually that would be the most ridiculous consequence, because then somehow the house has to have already existed as its own entity before it was produced to produce itself, and at the same time it has to have arisen from things that were intrinsically other, right? And so you get both faults. Does that make sense? Both of the faults that would come from self and from other would apply to if you're saying it comes from both self and other. And so the conclusion of that is, right, and then you have to first of all understand that if something is a product, right, it arose from cause and conditions, and it's intrinsically existent, these are really the four possibilities, right? It arose from itself, it arose from other, it arose from both, or it arose from no cause at all, right? There is no other possibility. So if you've gone through all four possibilities there in your own meditation, you come to the conclusion, my house is unarisen. My house, there is no intrinsically existent house that arose as a product. This is ultimate analysis, right? Conventionally, when we did just the conventional, of course we know houses come from parts. People making an effort and putting a foundation, blah, blah, blah. In the ultimate analysis, when we analyze, we just checked, right? There is no intrinsic existence. Yeah.
I just give a more extreme example is from your own experience. For example, you see someone get killed or get murdered, and this person is maybe your family member. So this very strong experience, negative experience. Then when you do the meditation on emptiness, how do you do the analyze? Because you feel your service when you see the away, and it truly exists because the person is not there anymore. I know this is extreme.
Yeah, that's extreme.
It's surely happened.
So a couple of things. Like one is, again, we have to differentiate the conventional worldly level and the ultimate analysis. Because on a conventional, again, just like with the house exists, I was saying, like on a conventional worldly level, that happened, right? If it's a phenomenon that, if the person experienced that, we're not refuting we're not refuting the conventional, what's this here, right? The conventional existence of that phenomenon. Does that make sense? So we're, just like anything else, we're not going to nihilism. We're not saying nothing happens, right? Nothing at all. Like so. So in your example of the murder, right? So again, we have to differentiate. If we're just talking on a conventional level, if somebody says, "My relative was murdered," that's the truth, you know. And the worst thing one could do, not maybe the worst, but a terrible thing would be to say, "Oh, that's just empty," right? In other words, that's not. So I want to say that, you know, don't ever do that to somebody. You know, if somebody says, "Oh, this terrible thing happened to me," don't say, "Oh, it's empty." You know, it's not. That's not helpful. But if it's oneself, right, then one has to check. You know, like let's say it was one's own experience, right, that this happened. You know, one saw this. So a couple of things I would say. You know, one is one has to. Honestly, I'm just giving an honest answer for a moment. I think one has to check: is that the right? Is emptiness the correct? For that person, if it's, you know, of course, if it's somebody else, it's probably not our judgment. If it's oneself, one has to check: is this the correct method to apply? Am I ready to meditate on the ultimate analysis of that phenomenon? I think I'm just saying my own opinion. I think there are times where, you know, if it's somebody who's very experienced with emptiness, then that's, of course they should. You know, if it's somebody who's not familiar with emptiness much, I think probably it's not a good idea to try it yet. You know, if it's a fresh event like that and it's overwhelming, my own opinion is that maybe better to meditate on some other topics, compassion and so on. You know, if the person's a beginner at emptiness meditation, because that's a very difficult event. That's just one caveat or one introductory point I would make. But then, still, everything is empty, right? So murder is also emptiness. So if one is ready to meditate on emptiness, then there's a way to do it. There are many ways to do it, you know. And so, what's to say, right? Like, again, but if you go to like a practical level, right, the person himself, their own experience, like, so if I'm putting myself in that position, I would imagine, okay, that's me and somebody I love was killed, for example, right? Then again, you have to say, okay, well, which part of my experience am I going to meditate on the emptiness of? Is it the grief? Is it the anger? Or is it the murderer? Or is it the victim? One has to pick an object, you know, because it's not a general idea. Oh, murder is empty. That's not actually a correct meditation on emptiness, right? So one has to really get at which part of the experience am I going to find the object of negation of, you know. And so I'll give an example. Let's say, right? If I were to say, like, again, because there are many parts of that experience. It could be the grief, it could be the anger, but you know. But let's say, I'll give an example. Like, let's say I was going to meditate on, if I put myself in that position, I think, okay, I hate the murderer, right? I think they're evil and I hate them, right? And I view them as this intrinsically existent evil person. I'm going to use that as an example, right? So then one would have to meditate on that, right? And to say, okay, so I believe they're intrinsically existent evil, right? I think of their face and I think, I generate some kind of hatred, and I think they're intrinsically worthy of hatred. I'm just using that. So that my object of negation is the intrinsically existent murderer. I'm just using that as an example, right? So then I would do the same analysis as before. I would say, okay, so does the intrinsically existent evil being exist on the body or the mind? Right? Just like we did before. So then you start to go, okay, so is, like, for example, is their pinky finger the evil, you know, evil, the evil person? No, you know. Is their eyebrow the evil person? You know, is it their aorta or their lung or their, you know, you can go through and you can say, well, those are all just flesh, the same as anybody else's, right? Like, and of course, also none of those is the person; those are just parts, you know. So you would go through and you can recognize. So this feeling I have, this is intrinsically, truly, an independent, existent evil person there. I can go through and analyze. Do they exist on this part of the body, that part, their foot, the left foot, the right foot, their knee, their this, their that? And you come to the conclusion, no, they don't exist on the body. Right? You can see that. Then you say, do they exist on the mind? Right? And then again, you could do the same analysis. Well, does that person exist on the mind? You know, at which time, at which point in time, you know, and the feeling might arise is at the moment they murdered my family member, right? But then you have to say, well, actually, you know, again, if you were doing an ultimate analysis, you would say, well, actually, even their mind, right? There was a process. I say that moment, right? But then if you actually analyze, you know, there was a mind at this second, and then, you know, and actually, there's a way of analyzing time where you recognize even a moment, right? You say, well, is there a shortest moment, right? But then, like, the shortest moment I can imagine, right? But even that moment had a beginning, a middle, and an end, you know, and so on. And then there's this flow of moments, actually, right? From moment to moment, you know, like, and you say, if they were intrinsically existent person, they would have to somehow exist over time, right? But there's nothing concrete there. That existed over time, and so you would recognize this idea I have of some inherently existent person there in the murder doesn't exist, actually. It's my own projection. That, you know, the idea of an intrinsic or inherently existent person doesn't exist. It's not real, actually. And one would then meditate on that emptiness, right? The emptiness of their existing as an independent person. That's an example of how I do it, right? Of course, that's a quite advanced method for something like that, but it's possible to do. Does that make sense? Like, when we can recognize then, wow, so then, and then this is the point. Like, so, in other words, my idea of an inherently existent person, the murderer, is a false projection. Therefore, the hatred I'm generating arises in dependence upon that false, my example of hatred, you know, may not, that person may not, but I'm using that as an example, is arisen based on my own false concept, actually, of this truly existent person, right? So the hatred itself, then, is also, let's see what you say, right? Is produced based on that wrong ignorance, you know. And in that way, the healing part of that is that then the hatred itself would dissolve, would decrease, or would stop, you know, depending on how much the person experienced emptiness in that sense. So that would be an example, you know. And one could do the same thing about the grief itself, right? In other words, grief itself, again, because everything is dependent. It's not to negate that it exists at all, right? But it's to say it's going back to the ultimate point that the Dalai Lama is making. Things are empty because they're dependently arisen, right? So this recognition, this experience is dependent, is only arises dependently, so it doesn't exist as some intrinsic independent phenomenon. It's empty of existing in that way. You know, now that doesn't negate that it exists conventionally. I just wanted to clarify that, right? But in the ultimate analysis, when one does an ultimate analysis, does it exist as a intrinsically existent thing? No, it doesn't. That's the, you know, so those are examples of how. Does that make sense?
So, Dr. Lauren, the biggest dependence is like you, subjectively you, like you create your own world, your mind creates your own world, all these affections eventually.
Well, another thing related to that I'll say is, like, in terms of dependent origination, right, which is the main point, this is actually implied here, it doesn't go through this explicitly, but it's implied, is that there are different, I'll just mention this, usually in some Buddhist texts they talk about 3 different levels of dependent origination, or 3 different levels of subtlety of analyzing it. So the grossest of those 3 levels is dependence upon causes and conditions, right? So in other words, all products, all composite phenomena, all, you know, because I said, like, we're not talking about space in a sense, or something like that, but empty space, but all things that are made up of causes and conditions, you know, are dependent upon their corresponding causes and conditions. That's one level of dependence, right? So, like, so yourself, for example, right? You know, you could say, well, your existence as a person is dependent upon, for example, your parents, and upon, you know, the mind, the consciousness coming into the, what's it called, the fertilized egg, and so on. So that's one level of dependence. Right? Then there's another level of dependence that's a little more, harder to grasp, or a little more subtle than that, which is dependence upon parts, and that's what we've been focusing on, right? So there, like you would say, you know, an object, right, a body or a cup or something, is dependent upon its parts, right? Like, in other words, like, it's not a cup if it doesn't have a front and a back, you know, a bottom and a top, and so, well, it doesn't have to, I guess cups don't always have a top, but they have to have, you know, they have to have certain parts to be a cup, right? And a body has to have certain parts to be a body, right? Whereas, you know, so it has to have, like, you know, front, and, you know, all that, right? 3-dimensional, things like that. So another level of dependence is recognizing how things are made up of their corresponding parts, right? You see the difference, right? One is causal, which actually everybody knows the causal dependence, right? Whereas like I was saying, like, a farmer knows that if you don't plant the seed, you don't get the crop. Like causal dependence is obvious, right? Depends on parts is a little subtler. Not everybody notices that one, right? And then the subtlest of the three levels of dependence is dependence upon label, on the mind labeling a phenomenon. And that one is very subtle, right? Whereas in that, so how do things exist, right, is what this is getting at. And so it does get into this in this text, right, where he points out, he says here on page 15, everything is imputed by the mind, but is not from the mind only, right? And so what his holiness there is saying, actually maybe we just have a couple minutes, so I'll finish with this point about because this is, I think, getting at your question also. So the subtlest level of dependent origination is that things exist as merely labeled by the mind. Right? But his holiness is making a point here. He's saying that doesn't mean, for example, that so just anything you label exists, right? So if I like, that's not what it's saying. Right? And his holiness makes a point. He says, I was getting at this earlier, like, so the object of negation in this sense then is ignorance grasping at things as existing as something more than what's merely labeled by the mind, which means existing intrinsically from their own side, without any label, without any mind. Say right, like labeling,
Concepts.
without any concepts. That's very subtle. It's quite, you can see, right? Even if you start to contemplate that one, it's the hardest one to understand, that level of dependent origination. So it means that they're like, and I'm not sure how much to go into this because it's a complicated topic, but
Basically, it's
I'm trying to think how subtle to get.
It's like hidden and then greatly hidden in some sense at a third level.
Actually, they would say this is still a hidden phenomenon. It's not extremely hidden like that. That, and according to the traditional, because it can still be understood through just reasoning. Whereas if you reason enough, but the idea is this: I'll go back actually. I'm just going to, because I was trying to decide whether it goes. It's always make some very subtle points here, which I think, given the few minutes left, I won't go into too much detail. But I'll go back to earlier, just as a way of kind of getting at what this is getting at. Earlier we said the self, right? And I gave the example, you could search your body, right? So you have this feeling, I, that exists in some concrete way, right? And then you search your body. We did that, right? Like, so all the parts of the body, do these exist there? No. Right? Then you search the mind, right? The past, the future, and then, the present, which is made up of the past and the future. You can't find something that's the I, right? The self, right? So that intrinsically existent self, that concrete self, doesn't exist at all. But then there is a self, right? Like there is, we all know that. It's not saying that you don't exist at all, right? So this is getting at, so how do you exist? Right? So it's saying, well, based on the appearance of a body and mind, you label. Right? We say, oh, that's Rajiv. Right? And that's a valid conventional existence, right? Whereas if I see Rajiv's face right here, and I say, oh, look, and he looks engaged in the topic, I can project a mind and say, oh, he seems like he's thinking. And then I say, there's Rajiv right there, right? And that's correct. It's like his parents, I assume, named you Rajiv. Yeah, is that a correct assumption, right? So based on that name, right, and the appearance, there is conventional valid existence. Right? If I try to search for a truly existent Rajiv on the body or on the mind, won't find it. Right? There's no intrinsically existent Rajiv, but Rajiv does exist as something labeled. Right? And that's a correct, valid, conventional existence. Right? So it's very subtle, though, actually, point, right? So Rajiv exists. How does he exist? As merely labeled, right? It's labeled by the mind.
I'm hurt now.
And we never ordinarily think of anything as existing. I mean, actually, we don't think of, like when you think of, like, when you think of your dinner, right, you don't think that exists merely labeled by the mind, right? But actually, you know, it doesn't exist as your dinner unless you label it dinner, right or not, right? Like, in other words,
Well, you kind of have a mental dictionary, and we have nouns that name things, and that's what we have in our mind when we come to the concept of dinner.
Right. And part of what Swami Lama here is saying is, so things do exist, and they exist in dependence upon that kind of labeling. That's one level of dependence. That's how they exist. It's not saying they don't exist. It's saying they exist dependently, depending on the label, and on the mere appearance. And then that's where I can then say very briefly. So then, as Swami makes this point, then you can recognize. I'll just, because I think it's very profound but interesting. He says, so then for something to exist conventionally, right, it must satisfy three criteria. So one is, it must be the object of a conventional consciousness, right, that labels it, right, that it can say, this is that, this is, like, so they can say, this is Rajiv. Right? That's one point. And people, and very, you know, like, that people can label, that people can see him, right, and say, that's Rajiv. But then it's always makes point, that's not enough for something to exist, conventionally, because, let's say I said, this is Rajiv, but then you all said, there's nobody sitting there, you're hallucinating, right? Well, then I'd be wrong, right? If you were correct, or as if I had a psychotic problem, and everybody else pointed out, hey, there's nobody sitting there, you're pointing in empty space when you're saying there's Rajiv. So it's not enough that a person has an experience and labels it, right? If I say, like, for example, if I were to say, oh, there's an elephant standing here, right? I'm not perceiving that, but if I were, right, and you all said, wow, you need some medication, you know, you're having a problem, that would be a correct, conventional, valid appearance, right? Because and it's always in point 2, he says, other conventional correct consciousnesses can't contradict it. Does that make sense? So if and that can happen in real life, like where so for example, I have some idea, this person was really angry, I can't stand them, right? And I hate them because they were so angry and they're such a jerk, you know, or something like that. And then like 2 weeks later, I actually talk to the person, I say, well, you know, I'm irritable, and they say, well, I wasn't angry, what are you talking about? Like, you know, I was sad, like something bad happened to me. And I realized, oh wow, for 2 weeks I believed they were angry and I was treating them this way. But then they're correct, or it's like, I can't read their mind, and when they tell me, you know, oh, my pet died and I was feeling really sad, then I realize, oh wow, I was wrong, right? Like, so in other words, so the first is, right, the first point was, I perceive something and I label it, right? That's the first criteria. The second criteria is, there can't be some other correct, valid cognition that says, no, you misperceived it. Does that make sense? So in that example, right, I thought they were angry, that was my label, but later, when they pointed out their experience, I realized, oh, I was wrong, right? So that would undermine, then that wasn't a correct, valid cognition. And then the third point Science makes is, remember we were getting at ultimate analysis. So the third point he gets is, ultimate analysis also can't refute it. Or so that means, and this is a subtle distinction, right? Whereas if I say that's an inherently existent regime, ultimate analysis can refute that, so it's incorrect. Does that make sense? But if I just say that's Rajiv, I'm not asserting that he's inherently existent, so ultimate analysis doesn't refute that. So those are the three criteria for something to exist. Conventionally, it's part of this, is a point this one's getting. So this is a very subtle. The subtlest level of dependent origination is labeling, actually, ascription.
But the convention...
Label, yeah, merely imputation.
But Dr. Lauren, the convention could be as mistaken as, I don't know, Donald Trump is our president. It's by consensus, but that's a convention.
Yeah.
He is our president.
Right.
In a way.
Yeah, that's often, I mean, actually, that's, actually, I was thinking that on the way here. I'll just make one last point. I was thinking of that actually, because oftentimes, I've heard a number of Tibetan Lamas use American presidents as the example of emptiness. But they'll point out, you know, when somebody's president, we actually develop a very concrete view of them, right? Where you see a picture of that person, and you feel some feeling, right? Like a very concrete feeling of who they are, right? And that they're the president. And sometimes, of course, and depending on who the president, then some people feel happy, and some people feel angry, and some people feel sad, some people feel joy, whatever. But it's all based on this ascription, right? President. And then you feel that they're president from their own side. And many times Lamas will use that example. They say, well, they weren't president when they were born. You know, they're not president after they, after their peace, or after they're stepped down from office, or after they retire, whatever. You know, there's all different reasons why somebody's no longer, or after, you know. So the point is like, nobody is intrinsically president, right? That it comes from a process of, what's there to say, conventional, you know, a whole set of conventions and interdependent relationships that lead to a label. Right?
But it's also a speech act by the authority of someone. Like when I declare in a couple, I declare to wife and husband.
Right.
And my husband. So
Yeah,
a
it's not
minister
interesting.
does that. So
And
he
isn't-
has the
yeah.
power to, through his speech act, to declare that.
Exactly, and this is just getting just one last point. This is getting, it helps understand the merely labeled. Let's use that example rather than president. It's a little easier. So, you know, because that's part of it, right? When a minister or somebody says, or just whoever, like somebody says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," right? And then there's this feeling like, "Oh, now that's the husband," right? And and what we forget, and then you see the person, right? And you say, like, especially if, let's say you were friends with the wife, and then you see the person, "Oh, that's her husband." And you see him, and immediately you feel that's the husband. And it doesn't feel like he exists as a husband merely through the power of my imputation. It doesn't feel like that. Part of what this is getting at is that's how he's a husband. He's only a husband through the power of mere imputation. It's valid. That's different than if he weren't the husband, obviously. That would be an incorrect, right? But if they really are married, right, then that's a correct, valid cognition that he's the husband, but it exists only through the force of, or it exists it exists dependent upon the force of imputation. Does that make sense? And without that imputation, the person's not, it doesn't exist as a husband. The mind has to impute that. All right, well thanks, Eric. Let's do a quick dedication. So there's 2 verses we sometimes do. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain